What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. I'm your host Dan, and today we're going to be talking about the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K. So this is going to be a bit of a long video. I'm going to do a full tutorial for this camera. I'll have all of the timestamps down in the description below, so if you need to jump to different sections of the video, you can do that just by clicking the links in the description below. So I do have the camera here in my hands. It does have the Tilta cage on it. This is the cage that they originally made for the 4K version of this camera, but it does in fact fit the 6K. So before we get started going into how to use the camera, let's just talk about the camera itself. This camera is a cinema camera and it has a Super 35 sensor on it. It also has a Canon EF mount on the front side. This camera was released in August of 2019, and ever since then it has been a game changer for the industry. This camera took the industry by storm, giving users the ability to shoot RAW video format at a $2,500 price point, which is still to this day completely unheard of. Now, like I mentioned just a little bit earlier, the camera does have the Canon EF mount on it, and it also uses the Canon LP-E6N batteries to power it. So let's go ahead and talk about the actual form of the camera. It is shaped a little bit like a DSLR with a giant touchscreen on the back that we can use to change all of our settings and also use as a viewfinder. From the back of the camera, if we take a look at it, there are 3 buttons on the top of the camera with the on-off switch directly next to them. Those buttons can be changed to any function that you want, and we'll get into that a little bit later. We also have an ISO, a shutter, and a white balance button, as well as a record button on top and a photo button so that we can capture stills with this camera. Now, working our way to the front of the camera, we have on the handle a dial that can be programmed to do whatever you want, but when it comes from the factory, it is programmed to do aperture. Moving our way towards the center of the camera, we have another record button. I don't really know what that's going to be used for. I personally don't use that as it's really close to the original record button, so I don't really know why that's there. And directly below the record button is one of the 2 microphones that are on the front of this camera. These microphones are great for internal camera microphones. I was actually really impressed with them. But there are a number of different audio connections that we can use on this camera that I choose to use instead of the built-in microphones. And then all the way in the top right corner, we do have our tally light so that we know when the camera is recording and when it is not when we are in front of that camera. Now, on the handle side of the camera, we have our card slots. It has an SD card slot as well as a CFast card slot. Personally, I don't use either one of those as we use the SSDs here, and I'll get into that a little bit more as well. So flipping around to the connection side of the camera, we have at the top, we have a 3.5mm microphone jack. Underneath of that, we have a headphone jack. And then directly underneath the headphone jack, we have our HDMI port, our USB-C port for recording to an SSD. Directly next to the USB-C port, we have our 12-volt connector. And at the bottom, we have our miniature XLR connector. So moving our way to the back of the camera, we have our giant touchscreen. And then all the way over here on the right, we have an auto iris button. So if you press this button, what the camera will do is it will take the average of your shadows and your highlights and pick the proper aperture based on those. And then underneath of that, we have the focus button. This is if you have an autofocus lens set to autofocus. If you press that once, it'll autofocus on what is ever in the center of your image. Now, underneath of the focus button, we have our HFR, which is the high frame rate button. Now, we would use this if we were going to be recording in 2 different frame rates and we knew exactly what those frame rates were going to be. So for instance, if we knew we were going to be filming in 120 frames and 24 frames, we could set our project to a 24 frames per second project and then have our high frame rate set to 120 frames so that whenever we press the HFR button, it automatically switches to the 120 or back to the 24 frames per second. So underneath of the zoom button, we have our menu button that will bring the menu up. And then lastly, we have our playback. So when we press this button, it'll bring up the last file that we recorded so that we could play it back. So now that we've taken a look at the physical features of the 6K, let's go ahead and jump into the camera so that we can show you exactly how it works. So for the purpose of this video, I have the Power Junkie from Blind Spot powering my camera with an LP-E6N dummy battery going into the battery connector. So once we have the camera powered on, it'll bring up the main screen, and from here you'll be able to do pretty much everything that you need to do. If you want to go ahead and record right away, you can just hit your record button and you'll be ready to go from there. But let's take a look at some of the settings that we can change directly from this home screen. So up in the top left-hand corner of the screen, we have our monitor options. Now, from the beginning, we have our zebra option, which is there to help us with our exposure. It shows you what is overexposed based on the settings that you put in. After that, we have our focus assist, which is also known as focus peaking. We have 3 different options for that. We have low, medium, and high. After our focus assist, we have our frame guides, which can be used to show us any range of aspect ratios. Following that, we have our grid, so that way we can line things up on our camera the way that we want to in the grid. After that, we have our safe area guides. This is there so that we make sure that everything that needs to be in frame is in frame regardless of what our crop is. And then lastly, we have our false color, which is used to properly set our exposure. So next to our monitor options, we have our frame rate. From here, we're able to adjust our frame rate based on the settings that we have in the camera. So for instance, if we are shooting 6K RAW, we have the ability to shoot up to 50 frames per second while using the full sensor. If we want to shoot up to 60 frames per second in 6K, we do have the 2.4:1 crop ratio. This is also a good place to show what your high frame rate option is, or if you are using an alternative frame rate while you are shooting. So make sure you keep an eye on this part of the screen so that you know exactly what frame rate you are in, because I can tell you from personal experience, it's very easy to change the frame rate accidentally on this camera. So next to our frame rate option, we have our shutter speed or shutter angle options. I personally like to use the shutter angle, as I know I always want to keep that shutter angle set to 180 degrees. Now, if you're using the shutter speed option, then you want to make sure that you always have that set to double your frame rate so that you have the proper amount of motion blur. And then next to our shutter option, we have the iris option, also known as the aperture. From here, we can adjust the slider to whatever aperture we want to have for our lens. So then next to our iris or our shutter, we have our time clock. This allows us to know how much time we've been recording and what the time code is for whatever files we are recording. This way we know that we are able to match it up later on in post. Directly to the right of the time clock is our ISO, and we can adjust this with the slider all the way from 100 all the way up to 25,600. So something to keep in mind with the ISO for this camera is it does have dual native ISO at both 400 and 3200. What this means is when we shoot between the ISOs of 100 and 1000, we use the ISO 400 as a reference point. And then from 1250 up to the 25,600, it uses ISO 3200 as its reference point. Now, something to keep in mind if you are using the Blackmagic RAW format is you cannot adjust an ISO outside of that range. So for instance, if you shot in ISO 800, you're not going to be able to adjust the ISO above 1000. And if you shot above 1250, then you're not going to be able to lower your ISO in post below that 1250 range. That's not a huge deal if you properly expose your shots from the beginning, but if you're planning on using the RAW format in the back end, then that is something that you definitely need to keep in mind. So next to our ISO is our white balance, and we can set this again using the slider at the bottom. And then next to our white balance adjustment, we have the tint adjustment, which can be adjusted anywhere from -50 to 50. Now, at any point, if you want to hide the display that we were just looking at, all you have to do is swipe up on the screen and all of that will disappear. And again, if you need to bring it back on, all you need to do is swipe down from any point on the screen and it'll bring the menu right back down. So now let's go ahead and jump into the menu options. So if we hit the menu button on the side of the camera, the first thing that we see is the record options. Typically when I use this camera, I shoot in the Blackmagic RAW, as now it works natively with Adobe Premiere Pro. That's my main editing software. However, something to keep in mind is that the file sizes for the Blackmagic RAW format are absolutely massive. So if you're going to be using Blackmagic RAW, you want to make sure that you invest in a good storage system. So let's go ahead and jump into the menu, and I will show you all of the different options we have for recording. So under the record window for Blackmagic RAW, we have multiple different options. Under this, we have constant bitrate, which allows us to pick our compression ratio all the way from 3.1 all the way up to 12.1 compression ratio. Typically what we do here at the Gear Focus Studio is shoot with the 8:1 compression on, as it leaves most of the quality there, but also compresses the files significantly so that we don't rack up a ton of storage space just for filming our YouTube videos. Now, if we click on the constant quality option, we have the quality 0 and quality 5. If I were going to use this option, I would use the quality 5. So underneath of the codec and quality options, we have the resolution options. Now in Blackmagic RAW, we do have several different options. We have the 6K, then we have 6K 2.4:1, we have 5.7K at 17:9, we have a 3.7K anamorphic, and a 2.8K 17:9. You'll notice that on this camera we do not have the ability to shoot in 4K RAW. However, if we switch over to the ProRes settings, we have a high quality 422 LT and proxy setting. This is, again, just different compression ratios for the ProRes files. And then underneath of the resolution, we have the 4K options available, as well as the HD option. Now, something to keep in mind when you are choosing your recording quality is the different resolution options do have different crops associated with them. So these 6K resolutions use the full sensor, and when we switch down to the 4K or the 1080, it does use a windowed version of that sensor, so it does crop in significantly on your image. So on the second page of the record menu, we have at the top our dynamic range options. Now, the best way to think about these dynamic range options is as your color profiles. So film is the flattest color profile that's going to give you the most manipulability in post, and then video is your typical Rec. 709 color space. Now, extended video is a cross between the two. It gives you the dynamic range, or a closer dynamic range to the film setting, but also allows you to have more contrast in your image like the video setting. So next to your dynamic range options, you have your sensor area, and this is a way for you to choose what part of the sensor you are using and how much of that sensor you are using. Now, moving down to the second row, we have our project frame rate, which I mentioned earlier. This is where you can set the frame rate for the entire project. So for instance, if I know that I'm going to release my video at 24 frames, I'm going to set my project settings to 24 frames. This way, when I record at a higher frame rate, it's automatically slowed down, and I don't have to do that in post. So next to our project frame rate, we have the toggle button for the off-speed recording. And then directly next to that, we have the ability to set what our sensor recording rate is going to be based on the frame rate. And then our third row at the bottom is for our recording media. So based on whatever recording media you're going to be using, you would set what your preferences are for your recording. So because we do not have our SSD plugged in, that option is not up on the screen. And then lastly, on this second page, we have the stop recording if the card drops the frame option. We keep this on just in case that the camera drops a frame, then we know that something is going on and we can stop and regroup and then set everything back up again. So on the third page of the record menu, we have our time-lapse options. First, we have the toggle switch for that time-lapse, and then we have the frequency for what frames the time-lapse will capture. We can set anywhere from every 2 frames all the way up to every 10 minutes if we wanted to. Now, underneath of that, we have our sharpening options if we want to add sharpening in camera. Now, typically, I don't do that. I like to do all of my image post-processing in the computer so that I know that I have all of the manipulability that I need on the back end and I don't have anything baked in. And speaking of baking things in, directly underneath of the detail sharpening is we have the apply LUT in file. So what that means is if you have a LUT loaded onto the camera, you can record the file with the LUT already on there. So if you know that your file looks good based on the LUT that you're going to be using later on down the road, you can automatically put that LUT onto that file. So now let's move to the monitor menu. So on this camera, we have the ability to have two separate monitors if we are using an external monitor. So with that, we have the ability to choose what is on each monitor. So the LCD screen is the LCD that is on the back of the camera itself. And from here, we have toggles for our clean feed, which means it has nothing on the screen. It doesn't show us any of the data. And we can toggle that on and off with that switch. We have our 3D LUT, which is the LUTs that I was talking about earlier, so that you can toggle your LUT on and off to see what your color is going to look like. After that, we have our zebra, which again is an exposure tool that puts a zebra line on anything that is overexposed. Directly next to the zebra, we have our focus assist or focus peaking. And then in the third row, we have our frame guides, our grids, our safe area guide, as well as our false color. So we have the ability to toggle those options on and off for both the HDMI output and the LCD screen. So if you knew you wanted to have false color on your external monitor, you could have that, but then also have the normal view on your LCD screen. We have the options for frame guides and the guide opacity, as well as our focus assist telling us whether or not we have colored lines, or the peaking for whatever we're going to be using. Then on the bottom we have our focus assist level, which essentially lets us choose the vibrancy of our focus assist tools. I like to keep that on high as it really makes the things that are in focus very, very prominent. And then next to that we can pick what color we want our focus assist to be, as well as the intensity for our zebras. So then on the second page of the monitor options, we have the ability to pick what our grids are. This will allow us to pick either thirds, crosshairs, or a center dot, or a combination of those three. We can't have all three of them on at the same time. And then at the bottom we have our safe area guide, which essentially gives you a line around the image to show you where you are coming into the edge of your frame. So let's talk about audio. On the audio page, we have the ability to select whatever our sources are for our two stereo channels. Right now I have both selected for the XLR microphone input so that I don't have to make sure that both channels are the same when I go to do my editing in post-production. But I can select anything from the 3.5mm left, right, and mono at line level, as well as left, right, and mono at mic level. And then we also have the ability to just turn one of the channels off, or we can use the microphones on the front of the camera that I mentioned before, as well as sum the two of those together to one single mono channel. Now underneath of our source select, we have our audio meters, which show us what the levels are for the audio coming into the camera. Typically when I am recording audio, I want my audio to sit somewhere in this yellow region on the camera, as that gives us the good balance between having good, clear, loud audio and then also not introducing too much noise on the back end when we boost the volume up. Now on the second page of our audio menu, we have the ability to adjust our speaker volume as well as our headphone volume. And from here we also have the ability to turn our phantom power on and off. For those of you who don't know what phantom power is an electrical charge put over the capsule of a microphone, giving it more sensitivity, allowing it to record audio. And then lastly, on our audio menu, we have our meter settings as well. So the next menu is the setup menu. So on this, we have the ability to set our date and our time if we need to adjust that, as well as our language. And then, like I mentioned before, we have the ability to choose between a shutter angle and a shutter speed. But for me, I'm going to keep it on the shutter angle, as I know I always want to have my shutter angle at 180 degrees. Directly next to that, we have our flicker-free shutter, which is for the LED light flicker that we get when we record at higher frame rates. In the United States, that frequency is 60 Hz, but then overseas, that frequency is 50 Hz. So we have the ability to choose between those two options. And then at the bottom, we have our timecode drop frame option. So on the second page of the setup menu, we have the ability to change our custom buttons. From here, we can pick anything from our frame rate to our iris, white balance, ISO, and shutter, as well as create a preset or a toggle for that. Now on the third page, we have the ability to turn our tally light on and off, as well as adjust the brightness of the screen. From here is also where we would do our camera reset if we needed to do that, or remap pixels if we needed to do that as well. So then at the bottom of the screen, we have our hardware ID as well as our software number. And then for our playback options, we have the ability to choose between all of the clips or a single clip. So then the last page of the setup menu is where we would connect our Bluetooth application on our phone, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So next to our setup menu, we have our presets menu. Now we could use this to make any number of presets for the camera if we know that we are going to be using specific options time and time again. We can just set a preset in the camera and click that and it'll set everything in the camera that we need it to. And then finally for our menu options we have our Luts. So we have the ability to shoot from 6K film to extended video, 6K film to Rec 2020 hybrid log gamma, 6K film to Rec 2020 PQ gamma, and then 6K film to video. So the last thing that I want to talk to you all about today is the Bluetooth app for the Blackmagic cameras. This app is by far the best Bluetooth control app that I have seen for a camera. It works extremely quickly and it is very reliable. The majority of the settings that you could set on the camera itself, you can set from the app so that you don't even have to get up and go over to the camera to even change those settings. So let's go ahead and dive into that app a little bit just so we can see what it looks like. So once you've connected to your camera, the first page that you're going to see is your color settings. So we can set our white balance and our tint, as well as any white balance presets that we would need. From this, we also have our autofocus button, which functions the same as the autofocus button on the back of the camera. And then at the bottom of the screen, we always have our record button as well as the card space and our slate. This is nice to see what card space we have left and how much time in recording we have left as well. So on the second page, we have the ability to set our frame rate. Now, if we set our project frame rate to 24, it's going to automatically come up to 24. Next to the frame rate option, you'll see an OS button. This is the off-speed frame rate, so this is the higher frame rate that we selected earlier on in the video. And then from here, we can also select our iris, which is our aperture, as well as our shutter, based on whether or not we have a shutter angle or a shutter speed. And then directly below that, we have the ability to set our ISO all the way from 100 to 25,600. And then on the third page, we have the ability to set our zebra percentage, as well as our frame guides and our grids and focus assist. And then on the last page, we have the ability to set our recording quality and our codec. So like I mentioned before, I do really like this app. It is very responsive and very easy to use. That's one of the greatest things about Blackmagic cameras in general, is they are very easy to use. They are very user-friendly and they don't really take a whole lot of time to set up. So that's going to do it for the first tutorial for the Gear Focus channel. If we missed anything, please let us know in the comments down below, and also let us know what your thoughts are on this tutorial format. We'd love to be putting together more tutorials for a bunch of different cameras for you, and we intend to do several more soon. And while you're down there in those comments, make sure that you hit that like button and you hit that subscribe button, as it really does help us out here on the channel. Again, I am your host Dan, and I'm always here to help you all feed your passion.